Hello and welcome to Ontario Soccer's newest podcast. My name's Rebecca and I'll be your host for this episode. Today we're speaking with Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt. She is the third and final keynote speaker at the 2024 Ontario Soccer Summit. She'll be kicking things off on Sunday morning with her presentation on mental health in soccer, which will be followed by a panel discussion on mental health. I'm so excited to speak with Dr. Tracy today about her professional background, her interest in mental health, and some of the work that she's currently doing. So enough from me. Let's hear from Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt. Welcome, Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt, to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm great. So nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Can I ask where you're calling in from?
I'm actually in my office at the University of Ottawa.
All right. Well, I'm here at the Ontario Soccer Centre. It's good to be able to connect with you, even though we're a couple hours apart from one another. All right, we have a lot of ground to cover in this interview, so we should probably get right into it. First things first, I want to know a little bit more about you. Can you tell us kind of like your background story and how you ended up doing what you're doing today?
So I'm currently a professor and Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in school-based mental health and violence prevention at the University of Ottawa. But I'm also a soccer coach for Ontario. So I'm a head coach for, typically I do the U17 team. And so I've been involved with Ontario soccer for quite some time. I'm also on the technical advisory committee, and we just received funding notification yesterday for a big study we're going to be doing with Ontario Soccer and 5 other soccer organizations in Canada to look at the abuse of youth referees. So there's that, but I'm also a soccer player. So I used to play varsity soccer, and so that's always been my passion. So, student athlete, and I know you know what that's all about, having gone to DePaul as a track and field expert. So, so I played soccer. I've played soccer throughout my whole life, even into being, senior soccer, and then I've coached forever. I coached even when I was in high school, actually. So I coached little elementary school kids when I was in high school, and then I've been coaching ever since.
All right. So you briefly mentioned your position over at University of Ottawa. I know you're a full professor and also the Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in School-Based Mental Health and Violence Prevention, as you said. Sorry, I had to read that. It's a
No,
mouthful.
I don't mind.
But I just want to know, what exactly does that mean? Like, what does that role entail and what does your day-to-day kind of look like?
So the Canada Research Chair program was a development by our federal government. It receives funding from the Tri-Council, which is Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and NSERC, which is Natural Sciences. Anyhow, so basically there was a big worry, and it wasn't just a worry, it was actually coming to fruition, where we were losing our best scientists in Canada to the United States and other places. They had a lot of money, they were attracting a lot of our best and brightest. And so our government put this program in place to help attract and retain our best and brightest, which sounds kind of conceited because I have one, a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair, which is the top of those chairs. And basically it protects researchers' time so that we could do what we're good at. And that's the story on that. So my day-to-day is, I bet I have the best job in the world, like absolutely the best job in the world. I get to educate the brightest students in Canada. I have a lab of over 20 graduate students, and they're all amazing and so smart and ambitious and keen to make Canada a better place for children to live in. And then I also get to lecture around the world. So I also have a professorship at the University of Oslo. So I get to go to Norway all the time. I get to go to conferences. I'm going to Vancouver next week, and then I'm going to Halifax the week after. I'm going to Australia to give a keynote in the spring. So it's a great job. And then, I also get to teach our future counseling psychologists how to be psychologists. So that's a really nice component of my job. So I have that, and then I can also marry that passion or those passions with doing research in soccer and also coaching soccer.
Amazing. Yeah, it's clear you love what you do
I
and
love what I do.
very
Absolutely.
exciting, very interesting career. So, on top of all of that you just mentioned, I know that you're also an editor of a scientific journal, Frontiers in Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, associate editor of Aggressive Behavior, and you're a president-elect for the International Society of Research and Aggression. The list goes on. I could go on and on about all the things you do in the world of mental health, but I just want to know, where does your interest in mental health stem from?
So I'm interested in two things. I'm interested in mental health and violence. So I'm not interested in the idea that people who are violent have mental health issues. That's not well supported by the research. I'm actually interested in what happens when people are targets of violence and how that affects their mental health. So that's where my interest in mental health comes. I was originally when I was coming through my education, I trained as a child clinical psychologist at McGill University. So, but I don't do clinical work anymore. I just teach clinicians how to be clinicians. But in any event, I think that my interest came from this early on in my dissertation when I was doing my PhD. I was really interested in popular mean kids, so popular bullies, and looking at the effect that they had on others. And then it just kind of continued on from there. So I've always been interested in those two topics. So violence and mental health.
Okay. And obviously, at the 2024 Ontario Soccer Summit, your keynote is going to be on the topic of mental health in soccer. So let's jump into that. Can you just talk to us about the intersection of mental health and sports? Because obviously there's a huge relationship there. There's the positive side where being involved in sports is good for mental health in terms of giving you a sense of community and being physically active. But then there's the other side of the coin where sometimes athletes struggle with performance anxiety or burnout or things of that sort. So anyway, I'll let you take the floor now. Yeah, just talk to us kind of about the relationship between mental health and sports.
So as you said, like one of the things that we know is that physical activity, exercise is really good for mental health. There are studies that compare other types of therapy like cognitive behavioral therapy and pharmacological interventions and exercise always does well. So we know that moving is good for mental health. But then there's also the other side of this that you mentioned that um, people who tend to play team sports, and especially if they're in the high performance stream, they tend to be perfectionistic and they tend to be hyper competitive, and they make a lot of social comparisons. And those things aren't necessarily good for the mental health because they're always assessing themselves vis-a-vis others and feeling like they're not making the mark. So that can be quite damaging to mental health. So that part we're going to talk about a little bit at the summit. But we're also going to just talk about how we know that we have an issue in Canada when it comes to youth mental health. Before the pandemic, 1 in 5 Canadian children and youth had a mental disorder. And that means that if you have a roster of 22, which we typically have when we get into full field teams, that you're going to have about 5 kids on your team that are struggling with their mental health. So what do coaches need to do to help support them? And that's also going to be discussed. So I just want us to think about these kids don't change. They don't code switch out of their mental disorder because they showed up at soccer, even though they may love soccer and it might be their passion, like science is my passion. It doesn't necessarily mean that is going to, well, it can't protect them per se against what's happening in other contexts because mental health issues are entrenched and they exist across different contexts.
Now, I guess we'll move into more of the soccer side of things. You already mentioned that you have an existing relationship with Ontario Soccer as a coach of the provincial Excel team. How long have you been involved with that?
I was actually thinking about this morning when I pulled out my provincial jacket. I think this one's like from 8 years ago,
Okay.
and that's my favorite one. So it will always be top of my list. But I'd say like 10 years, 8 to 10 years I've been involved with the provincial program. And I've also coached before that. I used to coach in OYSL and then OPDL and League One and also the provincial program. So kind of been involved in all aspects even like the little kids. I used to coach 7-year-old boys when I was in Vancouver, and I've coached little girls when I've been in Ottawa. So been involved in every aspect.
You're obviously very committed to our community, so thank you for all of the things you do for Ontario soccer. But for the provincial Excel team, I guess, what has that experience been like? I guess you've probably been to a few Canada games at this point. Yeah, just talk to us about your time with the provincial Excel program.
I love the Provincial Excel program. I've loved it since the first time I stepped on the field and worked with the staff at Ontario Soccer. They're so talented and they're so kind, and they're really professional, and they want what's best for our young athletes. The program itself, I wish, was better funded. That's nothing against Ontario Soccer. It's just a reality of all provinces and territories in Canada, because it would be nice to have more girls and boys involved, because this means a lot to them as well. But it's great. It's different from club soccer. We don't get them for as long. We don't know them as well as our club players. The relationships we build, we have to build them quickly. And then we're in an environment where everybody's a little bit stressed out and wanting to perform, because the implications are we have a lot of scouts watching the players play, and so the stakes are high. But all of that said, even with those kinds of stressors in place, I still love it.
On top of all of your work as a coach in our community, you also joined us last year as a panelist at the Ontario Soccer Summit. Was that your first time coming to the summit, or have you been to them before?
Oh, no, no. I've been to many, many summits. I'm, yeah, I don't know how many I've been to, but there've been a few, a few under my belt. And it was great though, because it was in Ottawa. It was actually in the building that I'm in right now.
Oh,
So
what do you know?
my office, I'm very lucky because there's not that many professors who have offices in our new CRX building. And yet here I am. So I would come into my office in between our meetings and go to another presentation or whatever it was that was on that day, and it was fantastic. And I was so happy to have everybody see how beautiful our university is.
Can you remember, I guess, when you were on the panel last year, what were some of the key points that you were able to discuss?
So we talked about safety last year, the safety of athletes in particular, and it was just really interesting. Like, it was really clear to me that we are all striving for the same thing, that we all want our athletes to feel safe, that we want nurturing environments, but that still have a standard in place. And so that was clear to me. So that was pretty good to see that everybody was on the same page. I still think we need to do a lot of work in that area. I don't think it's just athletes we need to be concentrating on. We also need to be thinking about game officials, match officials, but also coaches too. We tend to ignore the safety needs of coaches. And sometimes coaches can be bullied by teams, and I think we don't address that enough.
Very interesting. So will your keynote this year, will that be like an extension of the panel or something entirely its own?
It's going to be, well, I mean, obviously the safety concerns would be detrimental to individuals' mental health. So there is a component to that. I'm more going to be concentrating on just sort of painting the picture of where we are in Canada. So what did mental health look like before the pandemic? What did it look like during the pandemic? There was a pretty notable uptick in mental health issues in children and youth, and what are the implications of that uptick? And then what can we do and focusing on coaches, mostly what can coaches do to help better the mental health of their players?
Beautiful. Well, thank you for that little preview. Before I let you go, I know that we were already discussing this before the podcast, but you recently had a study published on social media and jealousy, which is very interesting and maybe not entirely related to the summit, but do you want to talk to us a little bit about that and maybe some of the other like topics that you're interested in researching right now?
So one of the benefits of being a soccer coach is that I I watch people. I'm a people watcher, so just be careful when you see me. I'll be watching you too. I'm a people watcher, and then I notice patterns, and then I try and test out these patterns. And I'll give you just one example, and then I'll get to the social media friendship study that we just did. So one thing I noticed was that a lot of times hyper-competitive players on my team made a lot of social comparisons. And those social comparisons caused them some distress. And the way they managed their distress was, I thought they would either internalize it, get upset with themselves. I'm not making the mark. I'm not starting at left fullback, whatever it is. Or they would tear down the person that they thought was in their way, in a sense, because soccer only has 11 starting positions. So a lot of times I would see them criticize the person that was getting more playing time, that sort of thing. So I did a study on this with my postdoc, and we found that to be true. And we found that the pathway was social comparisons led to jealousy, and jealousy then led to indirect aggression. So talking poorly about somebody behind their back, that sort of thing, spreading rumors, that. So that was a direct observation from soccer. We found it was more pronounced for girls than for boys. So during the pandemic, I noticed that because schools were closed so long in Ontario and they didn't have any other outlets, so they weren't playing soccer anymore either, that a lot of people were on social media. And what were the implications of being on social media? So for mental health, for social comparisons, that sort of thing. So back to that social comparison. And so I was wondering, what this looked like, and is there a new way to look at this? And so we invented this new scale to measure social media friendship jealousy, which is basically like, if you post a picture of our friendship group, but you don't tag me, does that cause me jealousy? Or if you are my best friend and you post a comment on somebody's feed that I can't stand, or if I see your geolocator is on and I'm sitting at home alone and you're out, like, what does that do? So all of these things that we know were increasing during the pandemic because everybody's watching each other's feeds all the time. So anyhow, so we did 3 studies on this with 3 different populations, one in North America, another one in just Canadians, and another one a longitudinal study where we looked at them across the entire pandemic. And we showed that that this is a phenomenon that exists, that women have more social media friendship jealousy than men, and that it causes them harm. It increases their anxiety and depression over time.
Very interesting and very relevant right now,
Yeah.
obviously coming out of the pandemic. And I mean, social media is just the way of the world now and will be probably for many years to come. So yeah, very interesting research. And I can't wait to hear more from you at the summit, and can't wait to meet you in person for the very first time. So yeah, that's all we really have time for today. We don't want to give too much away from your keynote presentation. So if anyone's interested in hearing more from Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt, you can join us at the 2024 Ontario Soccer Summit, February 23rd through 25th at York University. All right, Dr. Tracy, I'm going to let you go for the day, but thank you for making time for this, and we'll see you in February.
Thank you.
Once again, that was Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt, our 3rd and final keynote speaker at the 2024 Ontario Soccer Summit. If you want to hear more from Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt between now and then, you can find her on Twitter at Vaillancourt_doctor. Thank you for tuning in for this interview. I can't wait to see you all at the 2024 Ontario Soccer Summit. If you're still trying to decide whether or not you're going to be there, go to ontariosoccer.net/soccer-summit. That's again, ontariosoccer.net/soccer-summit. And you can find all of the information you need to make your decision. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.